Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Sunday evening live on air broadcast. I'm David Bell. I'm hoping that Reverend Dr. George Armstrong will be able to join in the video call later on. Hasn't logged in so far yet. That's okay. We're going to discuss tonight a creative life in theology, and I've got a variety of things that we can do to get that going. So first of all, let me just begin by sharing my screen with you. And you'll see here, this is the question set that we're working at tonight. Creative life and theology, we are going to look at what are the necessary skills to acquire. Then when we've had a bit of a think about that, what are the fields of action for a creative life in theology? And perhaps what happens as our faith develops over a lifetime? How do we respond to some of the loss of what I call props that keep us propped up in our faith? And equally, what about the evolution of principles? So let's begin by thinking about what are the necessary skills for a creative life in theology. Well, the first and foremost skill that people tend to associate with a Christian theologian is not primarily the academic skills at all. It's far more about the kind of skills that you acquire within congregational life. And the necessary skills from the very beginning of the church's perspective, the necessary skills that one had to acquire were, how do you live and behave within the framework of a Christian discipleship group or church or congregation? Jesus started a movement. That movement had a number of disciples, various followers, hangers-on, etc. And each of them had to learn how to live within the community. And so the first necessary skill for living a creative life in theology is, in fact, acquiring the skill of living within a particular community. Now, that perhaps is just a little bit different from what you might initially expect. You might think, oh, to have a creative life in theology, I've got to participate in academia. I've got to get an academic skill set. And that's not necessarily the case at all. It certainly wasn't the case for those first Christian communities. So the acquisition of the necessary skills begins, I'm not going to say it ends, but it certainly begins with the idea of being able to live in a community of faith-filled people. Jesus drew people together from disparate backgrounds and essentially established a community. He didn't establish a congregation, he didn't establish a church, he didn't establish rules and regulations, but rather he called disciples to fellowship with one another. So the creative theologian's life doesn't actually begin with the acquisition of academic skills. Academic skills do start to come into play the longer that you're in a congregation or discipleship group. I see we've got a number of viewers. We had 3 or 4. Please do feed your questions and answers in. That'll be a little bit more necessary, as I haven't been able to establish contact with George and get him into the meeting tonight as of yet. He may come in later. So use the Q&A to feed me comments and questions as we go along. But I'm certainly going to attempt to answer what it is to live a creative life in theology. And I would like to begin by illustrating. I'm going to go to a somewhat different screen share now. I'm actually going to take us all over to the Successors dashboard page. Now, when you're in the dashboard, you have, let me just bring that up so that folk can see it better. Well, when you're in the dashboard, you notice that there are a number of groups that you can belong with. And that, to me, is the first vital link between Jesus' disciples and discipleship groups today. People living a creative life following Jesus, they belong to groups. Those groups tend to have different kinds of interests and don't necessarily have all the same interests. Now, let me give you a straightforward biblical example of that. For example, when Jesus preached, a lot of his preaching was initially all about healing either of sick people or people who had the demons or the bad spirits. He was very much on a healing mission. He came to make people whole. Now, if you look at the huge range of discipleship groups that exist, somewhere between 1 and 2 billion Christians alive in the world today, of course there will be healing groups. Of course there will be other kinds of groups that confront the powers and the authorities with a message from the dispossessed, from the poor, from the outcast. So there'll be different kinds of interest groups. And we've been looking at that and developing it within the Successors framework. So a creative life in theology, for example, for us today, might be around the effective church leadership group. And if I go over into that group, you'll see now that it's set up in a slightly different way. You can get straight away to leadership training. Did Jesus have leadership training? My word, did he ever have leadership training? And that training consisted, as I said, not of academic things, but in allowing people to live and grow and learn within community. So I'd really heartily recommend our Leadership Plus little micro MOOCs. You can click on any one of them. I've only got a couple set up completely at present, but just for example, if we went to the one on faith, you'll see there's a PDF that you can read. It's not long. Then you watch the particular video on faith, and then you have a chance to participate in the forum. And so, in its own way, in the 21st century, what we're doing here is recreating the same kind of interest groups that developed quite naturally with Jesus' own set of with his own group of disciples, and how that evolved and moved on and became something else. So the first thing for a creative life in theology is, how are we going to learn to live in koinonia? And that's why those Leadership Plus MOOCs begin with koinonia group, rich cluster of belonging. I think it's the fundamental New Testament concept that if you're going to belong to a Christian group, you've got to do it around the koinonia cluster of concepts. So that requires a little bit of willpower. It requires a little bit of fortitude to be able to learn to live in community and ride with the ups and downs of community. And so Max Thompson has asked an interesting question at this point, and let me just select it and bring that up. Max, what you've said is, how important is it to find like-minded Christians in developing your community of faith? Well, God gives us companions, not necessarily of our own choosing, within discipleship groups. But I do think it is necessary to try to not find like-minded people, but so much for the group to be able to come to a certain set of common understandings. And that's the other part of living a creative life in community. how much will a community influence and take over and shape the individual response? Probably the biggest problem for Western culture today is, first and foremost, the spirit of materialism, but secondly, an overvaluation of the importance of the individual as opposed to the importance of the group. Now, you can clearly find the counter to that in other than Western cultures, where the group dynamic becomes takes over so much that the individual has no chance of creative development. So, Max, my answer to that question is that it is important that groups try to come to common minds. This is not easy, it's not straightforward, but it's certainly part of what it means to belong to a discipleship group or a cell group or whatever. So how one might do that is through the acquisition of skills. And the kinds of skills that we need to acquire are going to come out of academia to a large extent. There you start to learn skills about how do you order things in a way that gives rise to a dynamic congregation. How do you order things so that communications happen really easily and everyone understands? How do you order the witness of the congregation so that the important things that you want to tackle from a social justice perspective actually get delivered? So all of those things, I think, Max, come together. I don't think it's important to find like-minded Christians to begin with, but I do think that the essence is that the group has to learn to come to some common ideals and principles. So I think that's probably done answering that particular question. Now, I just want to come back and polish off the idea of the academic skills for creative ministry. You've probably been aware, if you're Presbyterian, Anglican, Methodist, Orthodox, there are huge training programs that people go through to get to be presbyters or ministers or elders or whatever. And that's in pretty sharp contradistinction to the Pentecostal groups that emerged after the 1950s, where the entire leadership training, and of course they had their precedents way centuries and centuries before that, their precedents were that you developed the necessary knowledge base from within the congregational life. So the academic, which is outside in the university or similar, as opposed to the kinds of knowledge that you gain within the community life, have been held in tension for a very long time. Now, I'd like to bring up one. Okay, now why have I shown that? I wanted to move to a second aspect of a creative life in theology, and that second aspect is, what are the fields of action? Well, if you go back to the colonial missionary expansion period, what you've got are people who are coming into an entirely different culture. It's for them the ends of the earth, but they are coming with certain presuppositions, if you like, certain ways of thinking and doing things that are not necessarily I see that Clive Dyson said he couldn't see or hear the video. So sorry about that, Clive. Thank you very much. That's odd that you couldn't see that. It should have broadcast to everyone. Anyway, the missionaries that came, they had these presuppositions. Wesley had set up a training program, a way of orientating clergy to doing theology. And I think it was a very creative way of doing theology. And what these people were attempting to do was to bring the gospel in a particular kind of way. Now, the spread of the gospel, say, amongst Maori, happens through indigenous theology, through Maori preachers, people who've been exposed in maybe over in Sydney, and they come back to New Zealand. So the gospel spreads in two kinds of ways. One where missionaries are bringing a certain set of assumptions, one which happens entirely within an indigenous understanding. Now, if you think about it, we're all like that. We've got people that want to bring theology, bring the gospel to us, and they're going to come with certain presuppositions. But there's also another way of doing theology creatively that may be described as the underground way, that's done by different people in different ways in different cultures. So that may go some way to starting to explain Stuart Mannon's question. Stuart says, how best does one respond to another community member who believes his belief in any theological aspect's absolutely right and therefore you're wrong? Well, of course, that always happens in community. And Jesus never said that communities have to hang together. His belief was that as he committed the gospel to the gospel would help the community hang together. Not everyone will hang together. So it may well be that some people within a community begin to feel that the community doesn't quite serve their needs. They go out, they form another community. They go off to seek the like-minded. You know, one of the most creative things that I've ever learned in the whole field of theology, oh, thank you, Max. I see you didn't see the video as well. But one of the most creative things that I've ever seen in the whole field of theology has been when I've had to learn that the particular opinion that was expressed, that I expressed, may not have been correct after all. And so that becomes a powerful method of learning. And communities function best when they regard themselves as experimental, as learning to live, grow, and develop together, as opposed to let's have rules and regulations that determine who's right, who's wrong, who's in, who's out. So how does one best respond, Stuart, to the idea of living in the community? The creative life in theology would suggest that the community itself can help people to function and flourish within the community if the community starts to have a number of diverse fields of action. Now, I'm sorry that you didn't see the video, so let me bring up a screen share that I know that you will see, and I'm just zipping back over to the Six Senses screen. And you see here, within, I think this answers the question in a very practical way, Stuart. We're in the Which Book Club. So as we go through the Which Book Club, we find that, if, just for example's sake, if I go to the forums and talking about books forum, here are a whole lot of different books that have been posted in by a variety of people. Where it says me, I'm just really posting on. Here's one by Doug Pratt, Being Open, Being Faithful, The Journey of Interreligious Dialogue. A different kind of book from the next one, being Making a Real Difference, Christian Movers and Shakers. That'll be by George Bryant. And George Bryant would be a very much more conservative kind of theologian than, let's say, Doug Pratt, who's on the cusp of interreligious dialogue for decades of his life in theology. So you can see, as we look at all the different books, what we've got are different ways of promoting being in community, different fields of actions. Now, if I just come back and illustrate this from a different point of view, one of the things that's happened to make Six Senses such a creative and interesting place, for me at any rate, since it was cut adrift by Trinity College in April of this year, and the funding was given by the General Secretary for a further 12 months while I developed it, we've seen the emergence of a number of people who work in creative spaces. So if you go to Which Book Club now, just for example's sake, we could choose the art and photography creative space. Now, click on that and you get taken to Joan O'Connor's drawings and paintings. They're quite magnificent, and yeah, you're welcome to look at buying them if you want. But let me just come back to Which Book Club. As we look at all the different creative spaces within Which Book Club, we start to see that the community is developing different fields of theological action. So you've got art and photography, you've got cinema and movies, particularly with Stuart McAdam and Matthew Morks. Some of these haven't yet been populated, but if we just had a look, for example, at the Muso Awards, there we've got Philip Gardside, who's not only a book publisher, but part of his field of action is writing music himself and singing it. His Festival Singers project, he's been singing, I don't know, 3 decades or something with them. You can discover that for yourself. You've got Dave Hallam, who we gave a Muso Award to, likewise Stuart Mannins. Here's another kind of creative endeavour. Jonah the Whale and the Worm, Colin Gibson, Anne Gray, who illustrated the cover there, Stuart Mannins and myself. We've all been involved in the creative process of putting that together. So in a sense, Stuart, what I'm saying here is, in direct answer to your question, how does one best respond to another community member who sees things differently? Well, I think the community has to look at creating a whole series of different fields of action and interaction for its members. Even if the discipleship group were only 12 members, each one of them will start to interact with other people beyond the community and create these subgroups. And of course, I think that is how the gospel makes its way in the world. It starts from the rich koinonia fellowship, and then it takes the gospel from beyond the fellowship out into the wider community. Now, if George Armstrong were here in the room with me, what we would discover very quickly is that George himself, in his creative fields of action, took theology out in quite unexpected and sometimes quite provocative ways. Let me just bring up the set of questions again, and just one moment while I make that. What we said is we must acquire the necessary community skills, the rich koinonia skills. We must acquire some academic helps, if you like, along the way. We need to consider that there are a number of different fields of action. No one field of action will satisfy the whole community. So it's a multiple set of responses. But this is where George, I think, actually showed a quite magnificent kind of response to a creative life in theology, and that was the response to what we could call the loss of our props. Now, what do I mean by the loss of props? Well, quite simply, as we develop in the faith, we start to lose some aspects of the faith. The exposure to community life takes away a certain kind of idealism that you might have when you first join the community. The second thing that occurs is that as the community itself grows, it starts to change its nature, its dynamic. It becomes more institutionally orientated. And this creates a set of props that it's sometimes necessary to knock aside. And I think George very courageously, in a whole lifetime of being in theology, doing theology, creating theology, living theology, managed to change the dynamic of not the church, but the society in which the church was placed. And he did that by very cleverly telling stories. Now, for example, if you take the Peace Squadron initiative, and that is where we confronted the American might with all of its military force, etc., wanting, as partners, as friends, to bring in nuclear warships, and we'd said, no, we are free of that kind of nuclear power. George organized the Peace Squadron around stories, and the story is very simple. You know, you can go out on the water and protest, and who could possibly have imagined the power that that would have? Now, it infuriated many loyal New Zealanders at the time, the same way that the Springbok Tour infuriated some people, and it became polarizing, it became divisive. But the theological life, the ethical principles that were behind the Peace Squadron, behind George's work with the Springbok Tour, etc., were principles by which Christians ought to have been organizing themselves. Now, the Koinonia community can only start to really be de-institutionalized when it recovers what those principles are. And institutions like the church, whether it's the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, whatever, they develop momentums around their rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations do not necessarily produce just outcomes. They do not necessarily produce outcomes that speak for the voiceless. They do not necessarily represent the widow. They do not necessarily tell the subverting stories of Jesus that he entrusted to the original Koinonia group. So the creative life in theology may be to start to retell, reclaim, re-emphasize some of those biblical stories. Now, how do we get to that base? We get there. Let's just go back over into the Six Senses site, because I think that is, here we go, just bringing it up for you. And on this site, what we can see are ways of getting to ethical principles. Now, how would I do that? Well, I'm going to come back over into the Effective Church Leadership series, and we see there we've got our leadership micro MOOCs, but there are also other kinds of educational resources. Now, if I click, for example, into the Share Forums resource, I've just reorganized the pages in a particular way. I think it's very helpful. What we have are the communities of meaning that we've got in Six Senses. They're all feeding into it, from Beckenham Sydenham Parish, from my own parish, from Manawatu. Now, these are not always kept up to date. Reflections from Post-Quake New Brighton with David Hill, and I sent a forum announcement out today about a walk that David is doing, series of 10 walks, I think it is, or 12 walks, over the next few months leading up to Easter, where he's taking a message on his sponsored walk to different communities. We've also got, just for example, things like the N7 Tropical Diseases Campaign. These are not necessarily the things that institutions can handle well, but individuals can handle brilliantly. It's the job of the institution to promote the individual program. So there's a tremendous amount, I think, within the effective leadership set of pages. But one that I particularly want to draw your attention to is we've got the set of pages about developing a lifelong learning plan. And the lifelong learning plan is about the response to the loss of cultural props. Our cultural props, our educational props, our institutional props, they all quickly become dated. They become limited. They become less effective. They become rules and regulations as opposed to being principles that free us up to do more and more creative things. So here is another example. Dr. Jim Stewart, who's contemporaneous with George Armstrong. George is a lecturer in theology and ethics at St. John's College, and along comes Jim into the Methodist College. And the two of them together have really quite a good time, a creative life that's full of interesting tensions, dynamisms, etc. And let's have a look at what Jim says. What are the opportunities for creative new forms of ministry? And he's got, I think these are the best principles I've ever set eyes on. Expectations of the church. Mission first, members second. Vision before preservation. Accountability before uniformity. And resourcing before constraining. Now, is there any one of you who would like to feed in on Jim's creative new ministries? Because I think there are comments that you could be making that would certainly help us to understand what it is to belong to a rich koinonia fellowship, living the creative life in theology. As you're typing in your responses there in the Q&A pod, let me just highlight, if you can't see it clearly on screen, the skills that are needed for ministry. Discernment. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had Clive Dyson and Barbara Moller in an absolutely fascinating broadcast. And there you saw two people who were really into the discernment understanding. From the creative work that they were doing, they were discerning where ministry was leading. They were not attempting the control of ministry, which of course the church does all the time. Mentoring, not directing. Well, I can't speak for the Anglican Church, but certainly in the Methodist Church, far too much direction and not enough mentoring. And accompanying the disciples, not detachment from them. And risk as opposed to comfort. Well, yeah, that one I'm not so sure about, because different action groups take different kinds of risks. Authenticity, not authority. Fluidity, not rigidity. Organizing, not piety. Those are the skills that are necessary for ministry. So, what else can we look at here? What are the qualities required for being in such a discipleship group? We notice that there's spiritual integrity. And how about this one? Apostolic effectiveness. Are we as effective at communicating our Christian belief, understanding, sense of community, joy of belonging as the original apostles and disciples and apostles were? Are we apostolic, meaning sending the gospel out on its way? And are we accountable back to our communities of meaning? So all of those things make for the kind of quality that's needed for a creative life in ministry. We will need to respond to the loss of props. All the education that I learned 30 years ago has to be revised. Maybe not all of it, but certainly large chunks of what I believed 30 years ago no longer apply and to make for apostolic effectiveness today. Then we've also got response to the enduring directions of ministry and leadership. Yeah, Clive, it seems, just selecting your question in there, Clive said, it seems to me that Jim has described Jesus' ministry. Yeah, he has, but I think he's also gone beyond it, Clive. I think now he's talking about something that has become, it's not universal, but it's so big compared to where Jesus started with an original discipleship community. So we've got a ministry of all believers within a community, so that you don't have some people set apart to do certain tasks. Well, you do have them doing certain tasks, but you don't have them having authority over and above and against others. It's the ministry is distributed across the group. You've got a ministry of pastoral care, sustainability, prophetic witness, ministry of vision. So all of that, yes, those are enduring qualities of apostolic ministry. And finally, Jim's last bit, the restoration of a credible apostolic ministry requires commitment and courage. Commitment to the message, commitment to the mission of Jesus, and the courage to follow Jesus in a disparate and changing world and personally incarnate his mission. Now, that's the bit that I really like in the whole of that presentation. Jim's saying we've got to make that real in our lives. Otherwise, we won't have a dog show of making it real for anyone else. We've got to incarnate it. Now, our original set of questions asked about response to the loss of props. The list that Jim has come up with is actually the answer to the loss of props. As we change, grow, develop, we actually build into our way of being in the community those things that allow us a positive, real engagement with the community, for the community, and beyond the community. The apostolic, our little koinonia fellowship is sent out to do the job of the gospel. Sometimes that will involve, as we said, polarizing opinions around faith and justice, peace issues, sometimes creating new forms of rich koinonia belonging. All of this takes us to the evolution of personal life principles. So, look, I've been just aware that we've got to 40 minutes and it will be time to go at this point. I want to say thank you very much for being with us. I'm sorry that George couldn't get in. I'll have a look at this particular video, see how it looks, and I'm going to probably publish it also onto YouTube. So once again, thank you. And next week we've got both Matthew Morks and Stuart McAdam and myself in the top films, and we're going to make a list of the top films that you must see, both from a Christian perspective and also from just a normal perspective. Films of great significance during 2015 and maybe something of what's to come. And that'll be our final live on air for 2015. So thank you, and I'll look forward to posting this out about 24 hours time, and you'll be able to come back and watch it. Thanks. Bye.